Ue waire, waire runga, waire raro, waire ngangaru, waire, wairea. Waire angaru nui angaru roa, wairea kia tau mai te Māori. He Māori ora. He Māori tiaki mai nei te ora kapute ia hānuku ia hārangi koia ko te hāora o te tangata. Ko wahakaki, ko taringa ka mau, ko wānanga ka hua. Hoi rā e rongo whakairi ake ki runga ki a tīna whāno whanake tū mai te toki a haumi e. Hui e, tai ki e.
Tēnā koutou. Welcome to the Whakapuāwai Podcast Series, developed by the Centre for Indigenous Psychologies. During this series, our intent is to develop and deepen understandings of Indigenous psychologies and why they matter. Through our conversations with Māori and Indigenous peoples who are leaders in their fields of expertise, we will highlight the ways they are guiding, being integrated into, and transforming ways of thinking and acting across a range of disciplines and applied areas. So, join us on this journey as we delve into the varied worlds of Māori and Indigenous peoples and better appreciate how Indigenous psychologies are affecting positive change in Aotearoa, New Zealand and beyond. In this podcast, our Kairangaho Research Officer Aorangi is pleased to sit down and share in kōrero with Te Aomihia Walker. Te Aomihia of Ngāti Porou is a Māori youth activist, marine biologist, fisheries advisor, Taei Ocean Fellow, and Arctic Angel. She has worked to protect and advance iwi customary and commercial interests in fisheries and the marine environment as a fisheries policy analyst. Broadly, her mahi advocates for integrated environmental management approaches in line with Te Tiriti o Waitangi, Indigenous rights and knowledges, with an eye on Indigenous-led solutions. Te Aomihia was a recipient of the Taei Ocean Fellowship, where she spent 6 months in Iceland researching how Indigenous knowledges can improve the health of overfished oceans. She is a member of the Arctic Angels, a youth-led intergenerational climate action global network of women who advocate for the protection of our global commons as well as climate action and justice. Te Aomihia also sits as a trustee on the Tairāwhiti Voyaging Trust to revitalise whakahaurua voyaging and mātauranga in Te Tairāwhiti. Please enjoy this kōrero between Aorangi and Te Aomihia.
Kua tahi ake, e mihi ana ki ake e pua, kua piri mai te rangi nei, nōku te whiwhi, nōku te maringa nui, kua whaiwa ki te whakapiti pororo ki aku I tēnei rā. So I know you were, in your emails, you said that you were maybe a little bit apprehensive about what more you could contribute to our kaupapa, to the podcast, but that is definitely your humility showing, I think. And I know that you've been involved in and led some really amazing and important mahi for our people throughout the various roles that you've held over the years. And so when we were thinking of kai kōrero that we could invite onto our podcast, you were actually one of the people that immediately came to my mind. That was because of the many kaupapa I know you're part of, but also the fact, like I mentioned in our emails, that you are a young wahine Māori, carving your own path in spaces that perhaps not a lot of young wahine Māori are very well represented in or will take much space up in. So, yeah, we're very lucky to have you on our podcast today. So thank you for being here.
Nōku te oranga e hoa, tira pia me mahi au toka pepeha kia mōhio ai te tira whakarongo ko ai au. Nō reira, tēnā rā tātou ko Te Aomihia Walker tōku ingoa. He uri tēnei o te maunga o Hekurangi, te awa waiapu o tira o te iwi o Ngāti Porou, ko ngā kōku hapu, ko Ngāti Rangi, Ngāti Hokopū, te whānau taki moana me te whānau hine pare. Nō reira tēnā tātou.
I guess first of all, did you want to just talk a little bit about the mahi that you're sort of involved with now, like what your passions and what your mahi is at the moment?
Yeah, sure. Gosh, where to start? My mahi is all centred around Taei Ao. It's centred around Te Tiriti. It's centred around kaitiakitanga and mātauranga and tikanga Māori. I would say I'm more of a practitioner than I am a academic or a policy writer, even though those are spaces I sort of dabble in now and then and contribute to different kaupapa. But ultimately, I've always been hugely passionate about our Taei Ao, specialising particularly in the moana space. Since a young age, and being a coastie and uri of Ngāti Porou, o tira kia tātou, huri tātou o Māui tiki a tāranga nāna I hi te ika Māui. So being, grown up on the coast next to the ocean, I mean, we are the ocean. That's part of who we are. And yeah, growing up for me, with my dad being a chairman on a number of marae committees up the coast, like I had that privilege of being able to go home and be a ngahi tere to partake in, all of the things our marae do, and just tag along with my dad. Some of those haerenga looked like, when I was very young and didn't have developed the understanding to know what they were, adults or the Pakikiwi were wānangering about. We were sent a lot to, go and get kaimoana, especially at my marae Leporua, and out to harvest boo-boos, to harvest paua. Those were our particular food kapata kai sources. And yeah, little did I realise, like, those aunties and cousins that took me down to do that, my passion for the ocean started to develop. And also just growing up around the ocean, it just sort of became more and more clear to me that I wanted to do all that I could to make sure that, everything that lives and thrives in the ocean continues to live and thrive in the ocean. And that sort of led me, like, at a very young age, at like 8 years old, to want to study marine biology and pursue marine biology. So I had that thought ever since I was 8, and went through high school picking the particular subjects I needed to get into courses at university, and attended Victoria University of Wellington, where I met you.
You're the only future marine biologist that I knew at that time.
There wasn't any other Māori wahine within my year. No, sorry, I take that back. I was in the class with Tara McAllister, who was another friend of ours, but I did take a year off, which set me back a year. I went and pursued wakaama and went to the Worlds in 2012. So when I got pushed back a year, I ended up being the only Māori wahine in the class. Yeah, got through that, got the marine biology degree, and did a bit of interning for a couple of PhD students to figure out, like, is continuing my academic journey in the marine biology space right for me. And it became quite clear, and just being young, you just want to get money after studying. So got me a job, my first job at Stats New Zealand. I also studied a major in stats as well as marine biology, so still in a bit of alignment with my tohu. And really explored there. I worked in both the statistical education team, helping to deliver to build capability and capacity in statistics throughout the public service, as well as in the Pacific. So in my first year, got to travel all around the Pacific to deliver the Certificate of Official Statistics, which was such a privilege. And then from there, I moved into the census team, and that's where I really sort of found how data is used and why it's important, and how it can influence policy. So I was in that team. I was out there collecting iwi and Māori descent information. All the data came in, only to find out that those who obtain the data don't necessarily, it just proved my hypothesis that they don't necessarily use the statistics properly, or they pick and choose which statistics to show, and their own biases sort of twist the narrative. And I just thought, man, that's a space I probably need to, I think I could probably influence a bit better or contribute to. So hence the shift from being an analyst and being a scientist to policy. Managed to get me a role after, and knowing I was missing the ocean space, a role came up at Te Ohu Kaimoana, the Māori Fisheries Trust. So I moved there and was a fisheries analyst there, policy analyst for 4.5 years, and moving from a Crown agency to a pan-tribal iwi body too was, I can say, very fulfilling for my wairua. And really did a lot there in terms of working with our people, working with iwi leaders, even within Te Ohu. There's in the narrative you hear today about the anomalies of iwi hapu, PSGE bodies, land trust bodies that all try to have mandate to speak on behalf of our people. I sort of worked at the iwi, mandated iwi organisation level, which was still for me like a great first step into coming into this, our very complex post-treaty settlement world, and figuring out kea waite mana, within the government's eyes anyways. I mean, within Māoridom, I'm sure we know who we are and, you know, what our boundaries are, and we don't need anyone else telling us that. Yeah. But long story short, it's been a great, it was a great induction into the iwi space, and obviously still in trying to bring forth and those values we talk about, like kaitiakitanga, manakitanga, all the tangas, and really having time to wānanga with different Māori in this space about what that actually means in practice. So, we like to chuck things around, but, you know, we have to sometimes take a look if we're actually fulfilling it in the way our tipuna would want us to, or vision for us, and recognise our own colonisation biases, let's say. So, that's been a space I've just been really interested in, and continue to pursue today. I thought maybe I need to stretch myself a little bit to develop my skills in land use, freshwater management, and climate change adaptation. So that's the kind of space I'm occupying at the moment, but again, still quite a peppy in this space, in those spaces. And just wanting to be a bit more holistic in terms of the service I deliver, and make it very encompassing of mātauranga, tikanga Māori, te reo Māori, and kaitiakitanga. So,
and in terms of so I guess the mahi that you're doing now, or the different kaupapa that you sit in now, why do you feel that sort of elevating, or actually maybe not so much why do you feel that it's important, elevating and recognising Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous whakaaro in that space? What is the value of elevating those perspectives in the space that you're doing mahi in now?
The main value, when I think about value, because we live in a colonised society here in Aotearoa, whether we like it or not, we are a colony of Britain still. That hasn't changed. I think we always have to be comfortable with having different, or at least two dualistic ways of how we approach managing our taiao, or managing ourselves. I don't like to say the taiao manages itself. It's like human activities that we need to manage, and it's different peoples, and as Aotearoa becomes more and more multi-diverse, you know, we still have that tangata tiriti, tangata whenua dynamic. We just have to think hard about how we not integrate our two different worldviews and you know, the ontologies and philosophies that sit behind the way we approach life. It's about really how can we uphold both perspectives in a way that whakamana each other, and use both to come to the table and find solutions, particularly in the taiao space, I think, but I think in all spaces, not just taiao. So definitely it's been a struggle, I think, first of all, to have mātauranga Māori and tikanga Māori and the Māori, Te Ao Māori, better recognised in terms of its value within the taiao space. That might not apply to some of our smaller communities and smaller areas that manage things on their own, like Ngāti Kahu up north, like the coasts, you know, that are those really isolated areas that, you know, the Crown or the government doesn't have presence in. You know, those whānau manage those areas themselves, and that's awesome. But I guess the majority of Aotearoa isn't that way, and the Crown does have quite a tight grip on certain areas, especially urbanised areas and other parts of the country. So just that value of having our knowledge system recognised is still a fight, but I think it's getting there today. I think there's more and more recognition of the value that mātauranga brings, and that's been a result of, for me, two things. First, the growing recognition of Indigenous rights through national and international instruments like the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which sets the bottom lines, I guess, of how states should recognise Indigenous peoples. And then the other one is the potential to curb biodiversity loss. So there's a number of stats that have been released since about 2019 that record, well, there's one from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity, released in 2019, that 3/4 of the land-based environment and about 66% of the marine environment have been significantly altered by human activity in areas held or managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. Another stat by the World Bank from August 2023 says that about 36% of remaining intact forests are on Indigenous peoples' lands. So, having these international stats come out is really starting, I think, to get that recognition of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing and being recognised better and more taken into account. Not given effect, but at least there's some forward movement there. And I think now the challenge for Aotearoa coming through is about how do we make it thrive, and how do we also, while it can be seen as a bit more equitable with Western knowledge, how do we start not fusing the two, but using the two to actually come up with some solutions pretty fast in this ever-changing world, with climate change being a big threat maybe for some of our tamariki mokopuna. And I guess that's for our generation to figure out. We have to make decisions very fast. So I think, and again, it's tough for us because I think a lot of us, our pakeke with that mātauranga have gone. Some have passed it on, some haven't, and I think a lot of us are trying to reclaim that mātauranga, but it's quite difficult to find. And depending on how connected you are with your home or those who had that knowledge. So it's a balancing act of trying to also build our capability and capacity within our own mātauranga systems, yet alone the science, the Western systems and knowledge there, and then also be responsible for trying to bring the two together. It is quite a lot to ask, but I think it's something that we have to challenge ourselves to do. That's where I see sort of the value of knowledge systems. That's our Indigenous perspective sits in. It's a challenging, but it's necessary.
And I think you make a really good point there, when you spoke about sort of we've already recognised or acknowledged that mātauranga Māori and Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous knowledge and practices are valid in their own right. And so we've spent so long fighting just to justify that it is a valid body of knowledge. And that, they do apply to all these problems that we've been faced with in the world. So we've done that. Yeah. And now it's about, and this is our, our responsibilities coming through as the next generation, is how do we ensure that that knowledge then thrives and continues to thrive, rather than still fighting for, well, this is why it's important. It's like, we know it's important already. This is what we need to do with it alongside Western science.
Absolutely. And there's also too a difference between, reading about it, knowing about it, and then practicing it. Yeah. Where it's just easy to read these things on your phone and watch a Zoom about with an elder talking or a kaumātua talking about these things, but we have to practice it too. Yeah. That's hugely important, and that requires a bit of sacrifice, I think, for us as this next reanga Māori to, we might have to find ways to take time off work to go and get out there on the moana or actually connect in the ngahere, or it's going to require a bit of that sacrifice, but I think it's necessary for us to practice, because no use just talking about it if we're not practicing it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, academics get a lot of slack for that, just sort of sitting in, what do they call it, the ivory tower, where you sort of theorize and come up with all of these ideas, but actually how you're applying that in real life. Do you have any experience? But it's about that hands-on practical knowledge, and that's that's also another learning space too, by actually getting out and doing the mahi in the places or the spaces that you're talking about, or that you're working in.
I remember Graham. He talks about it's like a funnel with a lot of holes, and the water's coming in. Everyone's got their place to try and block the holes, just emphasising that we all need to occupy different spaces, and that's very important. We're good at writing things down these days and recording things, but it's more okay, let's get out there and actually do the things our tipuna did. Yeah. And for me, I've just I think the place where I've found the most connection and where I could actually do practice has been in the waka space, to be honest. And again, just as an ocean lover, it was just a bit more of a natural fit for me to get out on the water, even though I've done one sail, but it opened my eyes so much to just how much I didn't know, that you can't know until you live and feel it. And there was a couple of times on the waka I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know if this sailing's for me, if I'm moana. But threw up for 2 days in a row, and then there was a lot of moments I had on the waka where I was like, oh my gosh, these people are too much for me. I don't know how our tipuna must have done it, because I could not handle. But once you overcome it, the sense of resilience, the sense of empowerment, that you're an uri of those who did these practices long before we had modern technology and warm weather gear and all of this stuff. So you just feel that sense of obligation to continue it through to the next generation, for sure. And I think more of us need to do that practice to understand those kariaroto that we help ingrain into us what we need to do and pass on to the next generation.
We're talking about the wakahaurua kaupapa. Can you maybe just explain a little bit more about what that kaupapa was and what you did with that?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I sit on the board of Te Haukomaru on behalf of Tai Rāwhiti. I sit under the rekereke of our rangatira Frank Kawe, who is a kapini that has been sailing waka for, almost 30 to 40 years alongside our other board members such as Hotiro Kerr. We also have a few members, Piripi Smith from Te Matua Maui here, who is another traditional navigator, wayfinder, Matua Frank, Māori Bursat from Te Aorere up north, and then some whānau from Puketeraki, Brendan Flack, Yayan Cramwell, who is our co-chair, in Nohoana ia ki o Tautahi, and Todd Trudago. He lives in Te Tiriti. So we've got an awesome and an amazing board in Marama as well from Waitangi Te Tāmaki. And pretty much this board was established in 2019 following the Tuia 250 celebrations, where the Crown or the government wanted to celebrate the 250 years since Captain Cook arrived in Aotearoa. But in that celebrations, we had they wanted to also emphasise the voyaging history of Aotearoa, not just James Cook and that colonial history. So that board was established in 2019, and their main role or function has been to hold national wakahaurua festivals, so bringing all the waka that have been established in Aotearoa together, as well as some of our smaller waka communities, like for example Wakaama, Waka Tere, which are those small sailing waka and sail canoes, and just bringing the whole kaupapa waka together once a year, and now it's biennial, to celebrate wakahaurua kaupapa and continue to promote it and have it embraced more by all people of Aotearoa New Zealand, because it is a big part of our history here. I obviously sit on the board of Tai Rāwhiti Waka. We were building the momentum to do we don't do many long distance sails, but we do try to make an effort to go to Te Haukomaru every year. So the first year was in, I think, 2021 in Tauranga. We had our waka go there. In 2022 it was in Kawhia. And then in 2024 it was held in Te Tiriti just earlier this month. So I sort of jumped on board after being on the governance for about a year and a half. Thought, I actually have never sailed a waka, and what am I doing sitting on a board for a waka? So I thought I better walk the talk, do that practice that I talked about, and I started going along to the crew trainings and building my skills in sailing. We still are building our capacity and capability in both sailing and, I guess, mātauranga waka, mātauranga whetū. We don't necessarily have that knowledge available to us on the tairāwhiti anymore when it comes to waka. We have that knowledge, stored in different motiatia, and some can uncode it, but then they're not practitioners on the waka who can apply it. So that's a space we're getting support from Haupomaru, from people like Piripi Snati and Te Matawa Maui. So long story short, started going to trainings and sort of put in my calendar once the dates for Te Haupomaru and Kai Tiriti came out, just blocked that out and made sure I was available for the sale. So yeah, we left Tūranga, we motored most of the way. That's the beauty of having a modern day waka, is like we can't afford to stay still. We still occupy, have to meet certain time frames. So we sailed down, try and make it to Kai Tiriti by the Saturday. So yeah, we did that and managed to get a bit of wind going through the Cook Strait, making it to Kai Tiriti on the Saturday, the 6th of April. And it was just an amazing, amazing feeling. When all our waka, because we met up with the other waka in a bay just next door to where the venue was the night before, and early the next morning we all came in as a flotilla, and there was like all these people on the beach, all the mana whenua, Ngāti Apa, Ngāti Toa, and Ngāti Rārua, a whole line of women calling us, doing a karanga for our waka to ki te whenua. And yeah, it was indescribable, the feeling, because it was the first time a lot of those waka, and for ours, that have been down south. And I can imagine too from the mana whenua there, where a place like Kai Tiriti, which has been, very unwelcoming, maybe in the past of Māori cultural, of the mana whenua, to have something like that there was pretty significant. And we just got all these comments when we got off the waka saying just it was like that our tupuna were coming back, just arriving from the islands from Hawaii, and you felt like that on the waka too. So, those are all those kariaroto you don't get from writing or from recording. It's from actually being out there and practicing it. So, and we had an awesome week. So the festival usually runs for about a week, or at least 3 to 5 days. This festival ran for 1 whole week after we arrived, and it consisted of having a couple of public open days for some of the public, particularly down at the top of the south. It was quite a different experience, so but awesome, and had a lot of people really interested in the waka and all our waka that were present, so that was really positive. And then for the most of the rest of the week we ran different workshops and day sailing for kura. So we had kura organised from around the top of the south, and a few came down from up north, where we ran workshops on the kapehe whetū, the maramataka. We were also gathering their insights as tamariki on what waka leadership looks like and what waka fellowship looks like, and trying to understand what our tamariki think of what the waka kaupapa is about. And again, that's all to gather our knowledge database on how much more work we need to do with our taiohi and tamariki in terms of their understanding of our voyaging history. So it's an awesome week, and that's kind of the whole point, again, is to promote that kaupapa, particularly to the younger generation, I think, but also our Pakeke and our kaumatua from non-Māori or tangata tiriti.
And that's really one way to revitalise the mātauranga, is get on the boat, figure out what happens what would our tupuna have done when there's no wind? Do they just, but then that comes back to that blending of two knowledge systems, right? With the waka, with the motorised waka, but also you've got the sails, so you can use both, draw on both when you need to.
That's right. And if you hear stories about, like, from Papa Heg, from Matua Jack Thatcher, from Tauranga, he's our another tohunga, and Hotu, when they talk about, because they all had to go back in the 80s or 70s, they had to go find that knowledge within the Pacific. So went back to an island called Satawal with a guy there named Papa Mo Pilangi, Pialangi, and because Papa Mo had children and grandchildren who weren't as open to learning navigation, he was like the last tohunga left who actually learnt that knowledge from generations thousands of generations that came before him. He was the last one with that knowledge system. We had lost it. Our whānau in Hawaii had lost it, but they had found Papa Mo, and who was willing to open up that knowledge to others, given his own whānau weren't as enthusiastic about learning it at the time. They did eventually, after seeing him sharing his knowledge with others. But so Papa Hek, Matua Hotu, and Jack Thatcher were all products of that whare wānanga, you might say. And yeah, and they were telling us, like they've had I've been in spaces where they've been open with people about Papa Mo and the thousands and thousands of hours since he was 2 years old of learning this mātauranga, of getting out on the waka. Before he could even say or captain a waka, he wasn't able to do that until he was in his late 20s. But just think about, that was his only job, was to learn whetū, learn about the Taei Ao, learn about the moana, learn about the sailing, learn about how to build waka. That was his whole life. So you really, in a society, a colonised society like ours, who has time to, from since 2 years old, to just focus? I mean, I know some whānau who are starting to look at that, with their tamariki, just not even thinking about putting them in school anymore and just being all about kaupapa waka, which is just like so inspiring. But that's the commitment that needs to be made in order to be one of those talking within the waka world. And if we don't have time to do that, that's where that modern technology comes into play and can be quite helpful. So yeah, it depends, like where everyone's at, and what we would want for our future generations.
Speaking of waka, although you didn't get there on a waka, your trip to Iceland, your fellowship in Iceland.
Oh yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I got sent to Papua New Guinea for the Western Central Pacific Forum to discuss tuna stocks, as well as some shark species and how those should be managed and protected, turtle species, other, you might say, species that had to have conservation management measures. And I was very lost. It was, again, I'd been in the role for 6 months and got sent to this, big, huge international meeting, and sitting in bilaterals with other countries, trying to negotiate, how much of a stock should be allocated to who, and who should be complying better with some of the rules. And, some of these big countries who actually have a lot of sway in these forums. So it was great exposure to that. But it became apparent, like, if I'm going to start sitting in these spaces, I need to get a bit more development here. And in my expedition in Papua New Guinea, I met a guy called Johansson Bell from Conservation International, and he asked what I was doing. I was like, I'm just an observer on the NZ delegation. Gave him the history of the struggle of Māori fishing rights, and that's kind of how I ended up on the delegation holding space. And he said, have you heard about this fishing program in Iceland? It's called the United Nations Fisheries Training Program, offered under the UNESCO body, so United Nations Education Society, something. I can't remember the whole acronym, but so United Nations program. And he just thought, given I gave him the history of Māori fishing rights and how we've ended up with the settlement, but what has happened over the last 30 years since the settlement is that we have, while we've got fishing quota, and just looking specifically at the commercial side of the settlement, a lot of people who run our fishing industries operation in the operations and the governance aren't necessarily Māori or whakaaro Māori, despite, and we didn't actually get the quota and start within the fishing business until probably the mid-2000s. So while the settlement was in the 90s, it took 12 years to figure out how we're going to allocate all our quota to all our 58 iwi. And so we actually hadn't had time to build the capability and capacity needed to run fishing businesses within Māoridom. So I saw this Icelandic opportunity as a doorway, not for me, but for future Māori wanting to come into the fishing industry and not just be, processing fish or doing the fishing, which is fine, but those who are interested in just getting a bit more involved in the decision making. So yeah, and then went over to So this program, which focused on developing fisheries professionals, gave us a bit of a holistic view on global fisheries, how things are done in Iceland, and then each fellow had to explain. There was, I think, about my cohort, there was 17 countries represented, mainly from Africa, a few from Central America, and then obviously me. So we got to learn about everyone's fisheries management systems, and then we went into areas of specialisation. Some went into the sciences of fisheries, some went into like how to count fisheries, do fish stock assessments, kind of figure out how much is in the water and how much should be taken, not taken based on the science. Some of us me particularly, I specialise in management and policy, so it's more like once that data's spit out, like how do we allocate the fishery and manage it in a way that's sustainable. Some did quality assurance, so those who work in fish processing factories, how to ensure high quality of the fish being processed and maximising its value. And there was another arm too, aquaculture. So some also specialised in aquaculture, which was a different ballgame too. And so after we went into our areas of specialisations, there were a number of lectures there, mine specifically around ecosystem-based management, bioeconomics, all of these boring things. But ultimately, the main sort of crux of the program was to do a 3-month research project that would contribute to a kaupapa back in your home country and truly influence. So we had freedom to choose our topic, and we kind of had to come prepared before we even went to Iceland about what that topic was. And so at the time I went over, the government was reviewing a policy called landing and discards, which is pretty much, in translation, what a commercial fisher should be able to put back into the water after a catch and what they need to bring back to land. And pretty much the minister wanted that change so that a fisherman had to bring back everything back to shore, and just avoid anything being put back into the ocean, because there has been cases of fishermen dumping large volumes of fish, like dead fish, back into the water to avoid being penalised when they come back to land. And they've all got to report their catch and things like that. But essentially what I did with that, because we were Te Hui Kaimona, we're preparing their select committee response, I did my project. I looked at creating a principled project based on mātauranga and tikanga Māori, as well as modern contemporary fisheries management knowledge, to come up with a principled framework using two-eyed seeing, which I'm sure the academic community might be familiar with, but it comes from a Mi'kmaq elder in British Columbia called his name is Dr. Albert Marshall, and it's called two-eyed seeing, which is using one eye using Indigenous knowledge and the other eye using Western knowledge, and using and seeing them equally, which is what I talked about earlier. This is where that comes from, and using them equally to view an issue and find solutions. So I pretty much came up with 8 principles of four based around mātauranga Māori. Obviously I didn't, because I was away, I couldn't do as much interviews, and I was quite limited in the time frame I had to make my study super valid. But I looked at some tikanga like around returning the first fish to Tangaroa, like around sharing fish, maximising its value, not putting anything to waste, as well as some contemporary management issues such as bottom-up approaches to management, etc., to pretty much come up with this framework about how landings and discards should be managed. When I was thinking about doing these interviews around fishing, like our traditional customary fishing, and just how different iwi, and again it's different, the practice might be different across different iwi and hapu, and acknowledging that, but there's also a theme there around reciprocity, around whakapapa, around kaitiakitanga, around manakitanga, all of these principles that you can still apply. So I pretty much found that if we were to bring everything back, even though some of that catch might have had species in it that could have survived out in the ocean, and based on my findings, actually, our tepuna did used to put fish back into the ocean if they had a good chance to survive. So that policy didn't necessarily align with our mātauranga. And so, yeah, just creating some principles for the next minister or decision maker to think about next time they review this policy. It was really interesting. I really had to fight hard to explain why Indigenous knowledge was of value, let's just say. I found in my time there they didn't actually have a relationship with their taiao, like they didn't see it as something to, have a reciprocal relationship with. Rather, while they were the first peoples of that land, they still saw the whenua and the taiao as something to extract, which I was quite fascinating. And, it comes from that Scandinavian kings, because ko rātou wera uri, you actually found that they still had quite an extractive relationship with their taiao. So, yeah, it was trying to break down that, our reciprocal relationship with the taiao, and being in spaces where you were questioned about that system or that way of knowing and being was quite challenging. There were moments there, just being on my own, where I felt really vulnerable and unsupported, but managed to get through it, and I'm sure I've become a bit of a stronger person or got a thicker skin for it. But there were things like, I had a scientist ask me, so you advocate for Indigenous knowledge and, the rights of Indigenous peoples, but what's your blood quantum? So, it was how to handle those sorts of questions was quite interesting. And I came to find later that that's quite a common question, like us in America. And I know that, Native Americans have to do blood tests in order to be able to access their treaty settlement rights. And, and you have to have a card showing how much blood. So it's just a different context. We're just so isolated down here in Aotearoa. It was quite interesting to be exposed to maybe what other Indigenous peoples have to go through and have to explain. And so those have been times that I'm like, whoa, this is different, and we've really got to know our stuff when talking to an international audience. Another thing too, I was lucky enough to have a supervisor. So one of my supervisors was Te Taiawa Te Amoko Mead, based here in Aotearoa, and she worked with me at Te Hukaimwana, but had done a bit of academic writing, and so just because she knew the exact context of what I was trying to achieve, she was an awesome supervisor. And then I had a woman called Rachel Johnston from the University of Akureyri, who was a lawyer, an Indigenous rights lawyer, but was a lecturer as well at the university, both in Akureyri and in Greenland, so which was just further north of Iceland. I think it's only like a 2-hour flight, and I wish I had made it over there, but I didn't. And what she broke down for me, because I was trying to figure out some of the alignments Icelandic people had with Māori and other Indigenous groups, was that extractive relationship. So I sort of had picked it up, but she sort of confirmed it for me. And then the other thing was, if she helped me look at the experiences of Icelanders compared to the Inuit Greenland community just further north, and that had been colonized by Denmark. And again, it just showed that while the Icelanders were the first tangata whenua of Iceland and have their reo and have somewhat of a relationship with their taiao, I mean, they had pūrākau around giants and seal people and, all these kaitiaki. But, it was always with this undertone of, extraction at the end of the day. But if you look at their experience, they were ruled by Norway, and then they were ruled by Denmark before becoming an independent state. But they didn't send, unlike in Greenland with the Inuit community, they didn't have to send missionaries over there to help assimilate their community into, like believing in God and I mean, they did. There was Christianity wasn't introduced in the year 1000, but it didn't take much. It didn't take them much to flip their whole world upside down, unlike the Inuit community just next door, who had the similar experiences we did as Māori, in terms of being assimilated into a certain philosophy, certain ways of knowing and being, the use of tools. What is it? The 3 Gs: germs, guns, and God. Those sorts of things were applied there, which weren't necessarily applied to the Icelanders. So, different experiences, and I found that we as Māori relate more to the Greenland community. So those were some of the things highlighted by my supervisor there that really helped me figure out and position myself better while I had my time in Iceland. I forgot to say, when I was looking at the principles, like other contemporary fisheries management principles, I was actually looking at different countries' management systems, and actually took a few learnings from Iceland, because they also apply a quota management system there, which had some cool policies and lessons, I should say, that we could have learned from. So I sort of incorporated some of what they do as principles to how we might approach that same fisheries policy we were reviewing here at the time. So I don't regret my time there, because it definitely still learned a lot. And they're amazing in terms of how they've been able to maximise the value of their fishery. So catching less but making more money from the catch that they do get. They utilise, I think, for their Atlantic cod fishery, 99% of the fish. So even the fish skins are used to make Nike leather shoes. All parts, those more wasteful parts, or parts that are usually put to waste, because of the volume of fish they catch, they have enough to sort of create economic pharmaceuticals out of their fish as well. They have the different parts of the fish go to different markets. I mean, because they're quite ideally located to the European market and the American market, and can ship things to Africa. Like, I think they ship the heads to Africa. They use the fillets, to be put fresh on the plates next day. In restaurants like America and Europe, they have the skins go to Nike. They have the rest of the fish go to pharmaceuticals or aquaculture feed. It's just great. And while it would be great here in Aotearoa, it also made me realise how difficult our fishery is here. We have less species, or we've got more species to manage, less volume, so we can't afford to experiment and see we don't produce enough waste or fish waste to sort of create a viable product. There's probably more we could do, but it requires funding, and the fishing industry, our context here is that the fishing industry pay for all that, whereas the government doesn't usually help. They've helped with a few funds over the years, but it's usually the fishing industry having to front up the costs to both fish, administer the compliance with the fisheries, as well as the research, and it just can be a bit hard on their pockets. So whereas the government fully supports the fishing industry in Iceland and pays for all that. So, there's just contextual differences that we can't necessarily apply here, but there's some principles there that we could take away. And so that's kind of that side of that Western mātauranga I looked at was mainly from Iceland, as well as a couple of other states that had quota management systems.
What are your hopes and aspirations for the future for other Māori or young wahine Māori working in this space, and also sort of just for Māori in general?
Oof, okay, I'll try and be brief with this answer, but I have to go back to what one of my friends have said on a podcast. His name's Ngārawira Pūmanawa. I don't know if you know him, but Ngārawira, he talks about being an Indigenous Māori and being a good tipuna is about continuing to sow the seeds of tradition, the seeds of whakapapa, and the seeds of language. So it's important that those seeds of indigeneity thrive and continue to proliferate and ensue forevermore. Therefore, for me, a specific key driver in my mahi is to help in that sustenance of Māori and Indigenous identity for now and future generations through protecting, maintaining and enhancing the mauri of our taeao and our reciprocal relationship with the taeao. As we know, the whakatauki e kōrero e ngaro, I'll never be lost, and this goes back to, I think, what we were talking about earlier, but I think our position now as the next generation should be e kōrero au I ngaro. We will make sure that our tipuna will never be lost by doing our best to ensure that there is a permanent Indigenous presence on this earth and continue to sow those seeds of indigeneity so that our tamariki, our mokopuna, know that their grandmother or grandfather gave them a fighting chance to be a Māori in the 23rd, 24th, 25th century, whatever that might look like. But always constantly making mokopuna decisions is, I think, key for us, and keeping our identity strong through all these challenges we have to go through in modern day Aotearoa. I think, in all the spaces we occupy. So, and when I look at being a wahine Māori, we are the knowledge transmitters. I think that's been shown pretty well and demonstrated in our history that it's actually our wahine who pass on the knowledge more to our tamariki than our tāne do. So I think as wahine Māori, it's even more important for us to sow those seeds, So again, just as wahine Māori, continuing to immerse ourselves in our own reo, in our own communities, in our own taiao, and passing that on to our tamariki, to our mokopuna, I think is our hugest responsibility. And we should be supported to do that too by all those around us.
Unuhia, te tapunui kia wātea. Wātei runga, wātei raro, wātei waho, wātei roto, ka wātea, ka wātea. Ka wātea kia i o te noho kia māma, te noho kia ora, te noho. Ko e rā e rongo whakairi ake ki runga kia tīna, aumi e, hui e, tai ki e.